Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum, and it's my great pleasure to introduce today's special presentation by our distinguished art historian, John Walsh. We're gathered for the second installment in a captivating three-part series called Paul Cézanne, A Harmony Parallel with Nature. Today's lecture, Cézanne and the Pull of the South, will explore how the celebrated French painter embraced his native landscape in midlife, developed his unique approach to still life, and created unconventional portraiture. Our speaker brings exceptional credentials to the subject. John Walsh arrived in Los Angeles in 1983 when he became the director of the Getty Museum after serving as a paintings curator at both the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. During his 17-year tenure at the Getty, he strengthened both the collection and the staff while overseeing the construction of an entirely new museum facility before retiring 25 years ago. Though his formal Getty responsibilities ended then, Los Angeles remained his home base as he continued his work as a freelance art historian, traveling globally to research significant artworks and develop presentations like today's lecture. His academic foundation, including a PhD in art history, has led to part-time teaching at Yale and speaking engagements at various institutions, including our own Hammer Museum. Art enthusiasts worldwide can access John's expertise through his lecture series on European and American art. There are approximately 60 videos available for free online that have collectively reached over 1 million viewers. Looking ahead, I encourage you to return on Sunday, March 23rd, when John will present the third lecture in the series, focusing on Cézanne's remarkably productive final years in Provence, painting landscapes and portraits of local residents. After today's presentation, please join us in the theater for coffee, tea, and cookies in the lobby, and an opportunity for continued conversation about Cézanne's remarkable work. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome John Walsh.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, everybody. When we ended the first lecture with Cézanne and his early 40s, painting landscapes in his native south, in Provence, I promised that we would move on, but first we're going to flash back 20 years or so with him, and just recap a bit of what we saw in the last lecture. While 20 years ago he had come to Paris while Manet and Monet and Degas were still struggling for acceptance by juries for the official salon and exhibitions, and they had been refused all too often. Cézanne more or less trained himself. He had a rebellious streak, and he cultivated it. He kind of projected it. One of his friends growing up called Cézanne that poetic, fantastic, magic, erotic, antique, physical, geometrical friend of ours. He absorbed outdoor painting, plein air painting techniques, working in the countryside near Paris, coached by his mentor and fellow radical Camille Pissarro, there at the bottom, who painted Cézanne's portrait there at the top, every inch the proletarian art worker. Their work is sometimes not so easy to tell apart. The curator Joseph Rischel wrote, "Their mutual influence over 10 years is one of the great chapters in the history of 19th century painting. At the beginning, the sage Pissarro endeavored to calm the ferocious young Cézanne. But as time passed, Cézanne progressively found himself in the lead, encouraging the older artists to follow his example in testing the limits of Impressionist landscape painting. In his choice of landscape motifs, Cézanne was full of surprises. At the left, a slice of farmyard confined by two high, unexplained walls. It's hardly the ingratiating, picturesque view that we expect. At the right, a dizzying complexity of a wooden bridge and stone piers and their patchwork reflections in the water under a canopy of leaves that he painted with short parallel strokes, a technique that we saw him use over and over in this period. We also looked at portraits by Cézanne of his friends. At the right here, thickly painted. At the left, again, withdrawn, both of them, almost evasive, both fluent and lively in the painting. Something similar happened in still life, a dozen years apart. On the right, an earlier, darker, and more emphatic technique, and then at the left, colorful and delicately balanced. Well, we'd arrive here at the end of the first lecture with Cézanne drawn back to Provence, where he was going to spend much of his time in the 1880s and practically all of his time during his last 15 years. This is the seaside village of L'Estaque, not far from his family house in Aix-en-Provence, where life was difficult for him as he reached his mid-40s. His paintings had admirers, but since he had hardly exhibited, there were not many viewers and still fewer buyers. In Paris, he was often ridiculed as a rude provincial or avoided. His patient mistress hadn't yet become his wife. That's going to happen in 1886. And the situation with his parents and siblings at the family house in Aix was uneasy because until his rich banker father died in 1886, making Paul's finances easier. His famous childhood friend, Émile Zola, published a novel, L'œuvre, the masterpiece, in which Cézanne is the unmistakable model for Zola's unsuccessful avant-garde painter who dies a suicide. Well, that ended the relationship with Zola and put an end to his visits to Zola in the suburbs of Paris, where he had painted this wonderful, shimmering view across the river to the village where Zola lived, and the castle of Meudon. So this is a moment to add that although we saw Cézanne had moved away from Pissarro, and although Cézanne's technique had evolved into something quite different and distinct, those short parallel diagonal strokes, the two are still in touch. For example, when Pissarro paints this large woodland scene, he's still using a whole variety of different kinds of strokes, the characteristic impressionist variety. But the lesson of Cézanne's technique sticks with Pissarro, and he can use it when he needs it, and he does. If you look at the leaves here in this composition on the right, he does until the mid-1880s. And in the mid-1880s, something new arrives. A system of painting that sacrifices dazzle and impulse and subjective untidiness for something else, for optical science. This was Georges Seurat's method of using small dots of related colors or contrasting colors to recreate in the eye of the beholder the experience of bright light and very subtle gradations of shade. Pretty soon, after the Grand Jatte here was exhibited, Cézanne attracted some followers, including, of all people, Pissarro, who was in his late 60s, but was still open-minded enough to give it a try. And he became enthusiastic about it, and patient, too, because with this technique, that's a virtue. Pissarro taught it to his Dutch protege, Vincent Van Gogh, who used it for some months before it got so laborious for him that he dropped it. And the same happened with Pissarro. But there were other believers in pointillism, or divisionism, as it was called, including the very successful Paul Cézanne, there on the right, and his protege on the left, Henri Matisse, working just 90 miles away in Saint-Tropez. Matisse resisted the uniform dot technique, as you can see, and compromised in this sketch for a picture of a picnic. Then he went for it in a version that went in 1905, helped make his reputation in Paris as a wild man, as he was called, a wild beast, a fauve. But that's another story. It's also the end of this little off-road excursion into alternative techniques during Cézanne's lifetime. Meanwhile, Cézanne would have no use for pointillism himself. He did hope for recognition, but he loathed Paris and the art world. His remedies were retreat, withdrawal from Paris to Provence for frequent and lengthy periods, and of course, total absorption in his work. This decade of the mid-1880s and early 90s is when he found locales for austere Provençal subjects, mostly inland, around Aix, and where he found ways of rendering them that he's best known for and we recognize easily. This is a view from the family property, now with gray-green leaves on the chestnut trees and drying patches of short grass on the fields, stepping down to the distant buildings and hills. The detail shows you that Cézanne is still experimenting with brushstrokes that are regular, but changing directions and degree of saturation to produce light and shade. In the winter, conditions called for a different technique, partly translucent, like watercolor, letting the tree trunks and the bare branches sort of do a dance in the foreground and reveal the blue shape of the mountain we'll be seeing a lot more of, Mont Saint-Victoire. Vincent van Gogh, who spent 2 years not far from here, wrote to his brother that Theo, that Cézanne's painting showed the harsh side of Provence. And that seems to be true here. It's dry and stony, abrupt, dizzying too. You don't see right away where you're standing or the path that was going to get you up that slope, but you do find it climbing there across the bottom of the picture and disappearing behind those kind of overlapping blade shapes, the blades of shadow that fan out at the bottom left here, seemingly from that green hub-like thing, and point us upward. The buildings sit there securely, with no signs of human or animal life, typical of Cézanne, but their shapes are active and quirky and credible, not in strict perspective, though. What's striking is the contrast of the flat stucco of the buildings with the shivery surfaces of the landscape all around, the most elaborate in all of his work. And just look at the smooth walls and how they contrast with the rock outcrop below. 3 layered steps, which he paints with short diagonals, changing colors all across, from white and gray and ochre stripes at the lower left, in and out of shadow, all the way around to dark gray and black at the right. He slips in strokes of contrasting color among the predominant ones, giving the areas of shifts of light or shade or tint without first mixing the paints on the palette. Below the outcrop here, the row of greens and blues and ochres, and some dry branches sort of cavorting. Another seemingly abandoned house is this one, the long ridge of Mont Saint-Victoire behind. On the blue slopes above, Cézanne reverts to techniques that he's been using with watercolor, darker washes over middle tones. He set up his easel in a field outside the town of Gardanne, a few miles south of Aix, and showed its buildings climbing up in a jumble of blocks and slanting roofs. He also toted his easel higher up to spots where he composed two quite different views, neither of them fully finished, but evidently put aside for some other time, as he sometimes did, but times that often never came. The appeal of the town for Cézanne obviously was the surge upward of the buildings, and they're mostly kind of vernacular buildings built and rebuilt over the centuries into a sort of lively pileup, unplanned, of man-made geometries. Cézanne found other places within a few miles of here that took his imagination, and some of them actually along the road. His interest was both human and geological. It's a rocky bank by the road, probably cut for building stone and then left looking a bit like a miniature village with red roofs. He's drawn to the geometry of the rocky bank. All those repeated diagonals are picked up in the hills way beyond, separated by a screen of vigorous young trees. Cézanne said, for me, to paint a landscape well, I need first to discover its geological foundations. He found it and painted it here with the utmost care, not simply to depict it accurately, but to put across how it felt to him, what sensations, what associations it aroused in him. And that would include amusement at these sort of visual rhymes that he came upon and made the subject of his own kind of visual poem. I need now to take you away from the dazzling light of Provence for a moment and go north with Cézanne in a very different locale that fascinated him and that he painted on several visits. And this was the forest of Fontainebleau near Barbizon, the cradle of modern landscape painting, which also stirred his poetical imagination. But what Cézanne chose to paint there was nothing conventionally sylvan or peaceable. It's a dusky scene of boulders. Meyer Shapiro described the picture as the vision of a hermit in despair. There's nothing and nobody to give us a sense of scale, just spindly pine trees, sky dimmed with clouds, and these amazing rocks jostling. Cézanne tints them with soft and sort of surprising colors. And look at that long rock squashed in right in the middle with orange and green and green and blue zones end to end, all over the spectrum. This is an aspect of Fontainebleau forest that we don't often see illustrated. This 15 square miles of sandstone eroded into huge rocks, where Cézanne, who's sitting there at the bottom, was able to find a soft spot in some ferns. It's not the relatively hospitable terrain that Corot had painted, where it's easy enough to find a picnic spot. Try that in Cézanne's picture. And it's not any of the famous oak trees, some of which were given names of artists like Karl Bodmer, who painted them. This is Monet in gorgeous dapple light. What interested Cézanne instead was a kind of prehistoric condition. Ancient boulders as host to some recent vegetation, a situation that must have fed his meditation on the sequences of primordial forces that brought all this about. And these thoughts had been on his mind for much of his life. Back in Provence, these geological sequences were very well understood, and the rock itself had been exploited for centuries, harvested in quarries like this one, called Bibemus, where you could see what was left behind and realize that humans had been occupying only the thinnest layer lying on top of eons of sedimented rock. Here's, in fact, is a map that could have hung on the wall of one of Cézanne's classrooms. The various layers of the region around X had been studied and mapped in detail, color-coded by strata. Inside the big blue oval there at the top, at the far side, is X. In the middle of the oval, in gray, running all along, all the way to the right, is the long ridge of Mont Sainte-Victoire. And in between are most of the places we've been seeing in Cézanne's pictures. In fact, I put a blue circle down there at the left for Gardin. I can't show you L'Estaque, which is out of the picture, down, it would be, down to the lower left. A close school friend of Cézanne's had, in the meantime, become a pioneer in geology and paleontology, the study of fossil remains of prehistoric humans who'd lived in caves there in those mountains. Like Lyell's Principles of Geology and like Darwin's publications on evolution, these had become a popular subject, a subject of general interest and excitement in educated French circles. So Cézanne painted that same geological friend, Antoine Fortuné-Marion, the man in the top center, and their mutual friend Anthony Valabrègue, as you've seen before, at the bottom, still in their 20s, off with him, Cézanne, on one of their long walks in the valley of the Arc River or down the coast at L'Estaque, examining strata deposited by millions of years of silting and then erosion, all of that beneath the relatively recent layers of animal and human habitation. Cézanne made drawings and small paintings like this of what he observed. And near his family's house, there was a ridge recently cut through by the railroad builders. It was a textbook cross-section of geologic history, and Cézanne made this large painting of it. Further up the valley, other people had been cutting into the rock for profit. This again is the Bibemus quarry, which Cézanne paints in strong sunlight, a deep pit with orangey red sandstone walls, mostly filled with giant rocks, bleached blue-gray at the top, and big trees. His spots of yellow and red make it dazzle. The short strokes give it energy and coherence. And if you look at the clusters of rounded forms in the center, they're so amazing and beautiful that you stop wondering what they're supposed to represent. In another of these views, here at the right side, of the left picture, you wonder, is that a ruined tower with windows? No, it's a rock actually left standing after everything else has been removed. And so what kind of event could have caused all this colossal mess? The trees try to hide it, but they can't. Another view. is positively scary. Now we can see what made the rocks collapse. People did, with drills and saws. At the upper right, the quarrymen have removed some of the rectangular blocks. What remains is an immense central pillar and some precariously poised slabs, and right across the middle, a sweeping arc that's collected stray blocks that seem to have their own little conversations going. Down below, there's a glimpse of a more colossal rubble. A few years earlier, another great painter working just 30 miles away at Saint-Rémy tried to convey the elemental strangeness of a quarry. This one with a grotto. Unlike Cézanne, he locates the quarry surrounding it by a heaving landscape that's created by his incessant curving brushstrokes. Van Gogh, who was a dozen years younger than Cézanne, may have met him, Cézanne, in Paris a couple of years before. They shared a dealer of sorts, the paint merchant Julien Tanguy on the far right, a man with a tolerance for difficult artists. The painter Émile Bernard reported this slightly fishy-sounding story, but still worth repeating. One afternoon when Cézanne came up to Paris, Vincent, who had had lunch there, met him at Tanguy's. They chatted together, and after having talked about art in general, they started in on their own individual ideas. Van Gogh could not explain his theories better than by showing his pictures to Cézanne and asking his opinion of them. He brought out canvases of various kinds, portraits, still lifes, landscapes. Cézanne, whose nature was timid but violent, said, after inspecting them all, "Truly, you paint like a madman." In this view, on the right, we get the idea of what it would be like to walk in the path down there in the quarry and be enveloped. Nina Athanasiou, who's written very helpfully about Cézanne's Provençal works, pointed out that the strange shape of the intruding rock face there on the right was made by a quarryman with a mechanical saw. The contrast with the exuberant life of the foliage is violent. But she describes the brushstrokes here on the left beautifully. She says, they are a masterful demonstration of Cézanne's application of hatching, his brushwork of parallel diagonal strokes that both constructed and deconstructed solid form into dematerialized, evanescent, vibrant surfaces, painted in patches of thin striations of green and yellow. The pine trees shimmer from underneath their invisible atmospheric curtain of heat and sunlight. Well, you can actually go, and some of you may have done, you can go there to the quarry and you can get some of that feeling yourself. It's normally open to the public. You better check first, though, when you go and get a guide to let you in, because that may be necessary. Anyway, you can check on the website, which I've put in the readings on the website here, the Hammer website. There's also a notice that will take you directly to the tourist authorities in Aix-en-Provence. You should go, by the way. Anyway, because of quarrying started up again for a little while during World War II, the rocks are very different now, and the trees have grown up. But you can go along a path that passes the little cabin that Cézanne used to store his easel and canvases, and you can go out on a platform with a view of the mountain. The great painting in Baltimore has us looking across the quarry in a composition where the bulk of the mountain echoes the upthrust of the bulging pillar of the quarry itself, and seemingly pushed up by converging pines at the left and framed by the tall tree at the right edge. And up closer, you can see a couple of big discs, as though they were millstones cut and abandoned, which as they may be. Anyway, it's an image of superhuman forces at work across immeasurable time, right through up to our own human interventions, and even to lowly, persistent plant life. Well, enough of rocks for now. Let's talk about trees. One of the beloved subjects for 19th century landscape painters and collectors was the so-called sous-bois, a shady scene in the woods, under spreading branches with canopies of leaves and soft spotted light on the forest floor. Here's Pissarro again. And on the right, another important protege of Pissarro's, Paul Gauguin. I'm pretty confident that nobody had ever done a sous-bois like this one. This tall format is unusual for Cézanne. There's no bosky landscape and no shady undergrowth, just a hill, but a lot going on up above with the snaky trunks and spiky branches, a kind of wild dance of limbs flung out, wearing wispy fronds of green, every tint of green, shot through with light. And there are shrubs and grass below, buzzing with muted color, but put down in quick, short strokes. The picture is absolutely one of a kind, and it deserves a long, slow look. And best of all, it's here in LA, and you can do that. Here the trees are better behaved. The scene is probably also in Provence, a sort of syncopated march of trees that have grown up straight among boulders that Cézanne painted with firm outlines and delicate, translucent colors, and then finished with scribbling black shadows into the deep crevices, where he gets to get some added vibrancy. He uses the familiar diagonal hatchings that you recognize from the quarry, and to give life to the sky, he puts yellow, you can see that on the upper right, puts yellow in between the branches. Now a different proposition, a rock pile. There's no land on either side to explain its situation, but there's a blue sky and a mass of rock surging upward and supporting tall trees that reach even higher. The feeling is different from the slopes of the Chateau Noir, as you're going to see in a minute, where the slopes above have sent boulders crashing down. Here, no explanation for the pileup, and no sense of crushing gravity either. But there's one of the most sumptuous compositions of rock in all of art. Nothing slapdash or even speedy about it, nothing impressionist even. It's built at the right, you can see, with blunt, wide strokes of white and gray, carefully applied. In the center and the left, a kind of jittering mass of diagonals. And look at the right side. The right side is just a mass of green. That's the pines summarized. We don't really need more detail. Some eloquent trees here, painted by themselves, minus rocks, a pair of them, both of a certain age, weathered and bent and broken off here and there. In between them and farther back, a perfectly straight tree, evidently much younger. In the watercolor study, he gives the trees close attention. He adjusts the contours and makes discrete indications of color and shading. Then he takes this upright canvas and paints the trees on a patchwork of ground, moving them closer together, copying the left-hand tree pretty closely in the painting, but applying new twists to the branches, including a couple of them branches, that is, that reach all across the top of the picture to the right-hand tree, almost to the point of touching. The effect in the painting, combined with the repeated outlines and the splashes and dashes of the leaves, is commotion, something like the trees in the Lacma picture. Trees have associations for Cézanne. He feels wonder and excitement at them as he looks. That sensation, that word that he keeps using, that sensation is what he labors to pass on to us, even if the product looks untidy and incomplete. And here I'd go a step farther. I think he's inviting us to make our own human associations with those trees. The couple, the exuberant limbs coming together, even the upright young tree in between. You could say, and I do say, that he makes them alive like us, well-worn, vigorous, and in the presence of a successor. Now, a quick footnote on trees at this moment. This is 1891. Here's what Cézanne's friend and admirer Camille Monet was painting near Giverny. And here is, about the same time, a river view by Cézanne, probably also painted in one of those rivers in the north. And you can see that Cézanne didn't start with a graceful, unified, planned composition the way Monet did, but instead began with the houses and the boats and their forms reflected pretty willy-nilly in the center, wildly broken up. He worked outward. The trees were going to be the main thing in the picture, bending with the wind more or less in unison, but they're improvised, and he clearly didn't finish the picture. With that, we're going to go back to the portraits that Cézanne had been painting in Paris and Provence during these past dozen years. Cézanne's portrait sitters in his early years were all his friends and all men, except for his companion Hortense. You've seen this man a few times with his gently inclined posture and an expression that seems reflective. He painted it not long after this notorious portrait, which he had submitted to the Salon jury, basically defying them to accept it. Another friend of his in Aix, a man with a quick and sensitive mind who was deformed at birth. Cézanne posed him frontally, almost life-size, regally, you could say, in an armchair as though it were a throne, and his feet on a stool like royalty. And up above his head, his name in an inscription, like a grandee, but with his profession, painter, in stencil letters, like a tradesman. Cézanne drew him twice, two really beautiful, soulful heads with a sort of 17th century flavor, like Cézanne, like Van Dyck. By sticking it to the Salon jury, Cézanne got some of the attention he wanted, but it was from a cartoonist. He's shown as a wild man with a nude painting pinned to his ear and brandishing his portrait of Empereur. You saw him at the left, at the beginning of his career, using a palette knife and thick oil paint to present himself as a rough customer, somebody not to be trifled with. A dozen years later, on the right, he's still wary with the painting technique that's still rough, still abrupt, but it's painted with brushes, and behind him on the wall there's a landscape by a friend of his, sort of a humanizing attribute of his trade. The face is less challenging, perhaps even quizzical. Cézanne's development as a portrait painter doesn't proceed in a straight line. One of the experiments he did with his friends was with a modest customs official called Victor Choquet, who became Cézanne's most avid collector and who was very well known in the Impressionist circle. Cézanne and several of his contemporaries painted his portrait. I have a little exercise for you to look at these three portraits and Choquet, made of Choquet, a couple of years apart, same size, and decide which one you prefer, or which you prefer, and which is by Cézanne. No winners, no prizes, no hurry. Just have a look. Well, you could hardly find a bigger contrast than Renoir's delicate portrait on the left. The soulful directness of his eyes and the delicate fingers and the intimacy with the painting behind him, Renoir's weave of small touches for the fabric and feathery strokes for his hair, all that gives Choquet a sympathetic kind of refinement. It's worth comparing, I think, the other two by Cézanne up close. On the left, he gives Choquet a longer face and abstracted expression, a hair that's thick with a heavy buildup of paint. On the right, the surface agitation is gone. The thinner paint is patiently applied and may suggest something of what Cézanne had to say about Choquet and also about himself. I'm struck by his serenity. Faith has not endowed me with an equal stability, which is the only regret I have about the things on this earth. Stability. This applies, I think, to another portrait of Choquet at home, in his slippers, at ease, a casual pose, surrounded by his furniture and his paintings. You've seen that working alongside his kindly mentor, Cézanne absorbed Impressionist light and color, while Pissarro absorbed something of Cézanne's originality as a composer. Here, Cézanne has an amazing idea. The expression is similar, but he's had a haircut and he's put himself in front of a wallpaper with a great big Rococo pattern on a kind of polite pink. Cézanne paints the pattern roughly, if impatiently, as though he were signaling and even acting out some of his own bottled-up energy. The gentle colors may reflect Pissarro's civilizing influence, but there was another person with influence in these same years. That is Cézanne's companion and wife-to-be, Hortense Fiquet. Like Cézanne, she was from the provinces, and her case from eastern France, from the Jura, a respectable family, several rungs down the social ladder from Cézanne's, a woman who'd worked as a bookbinder and had a flair for clothes. By now they had a 5-year-old son called Paul. She sits in their huge wing armchair in their Paris apartment, comfortable in her pose, leaning on one arm, looking in the general direction of the artist, but not focusing, seemingly lost in thought. Her face may not tell us much about her personality, and her expression might leave us wondering about their relationship, which proved actually to be durable. And she was a patient, reliable model for countless long sessions. She sat for nearly 30 portraits, and each of them would typically take many, many sittings. So she was a working partner. She gave Cézanne the opportunity to refine his techniques of rendering delicate colors and skin tones and costume. You see how her face is delicately modeled and in flat planes. Look at her chin. And look at the highlights everywhere on the face. But in the picture, maybe the most amazing thing is the skirt. It's made of rippling bands, sort of limpid stripes, each one very gently modeled, like watercolor, mottled in muted greens and grays and blues. He gets the effect of a shiny alternating with matte. So he paints on a light ground here, and he leaves bits of it unpainted to form highlights. All in all, it is a gorgeous and sympathetic portrait and a display of virtuosity, but virtuosity that doesn't make a show of itself, but by its technique creates new possibilities for oil paint. Her gentle lean to one side is a device that Cézanne uses in many portraits of Hortense, calculated imbalance. In fact, for the next great portrait on the right here, calculated imbalance is what makes this life-size portrait a dozen or so years later so wonderfully strange. He's turned her chair away from the wall. Behind her, that chair rail dips down in a diagonal in the direction of her gentle lean, but the rail is discontinuous on either side of her. In fact, the surroundings are all a bit askew or afloat, like the mirror in a gilt frame in the upper left above the fireplace, which we really only recognize as a fireplace because of the tongs propped up next to it. The heavy curtain at the right has no visible means of support. So we're obviously not expected to take this as an accurate rendition of the interior. So are these devices suggesting something about her? Maybe that she's a steadying force, despite her own slight tilt, in an otherwise unsteady household? Well, D.H. Lawrence, who wrote beautifully about Cézanne, D.H. Lawrence wrote that by making her still, the artist starts making the universe slip uneasily about her. It was part of the desire to make the human form, the life form, come to rest, not static, on the contrary, mobile, but come to rest. And at the same time, he set the unmoving material world into motion. There are 29 more paintings of Hortense in existence, most of them quite different in size and finish and how she looks. 10 years ago, at the Met, had a marvelous exhibition on the subject of Madame Cézanne. Charlotte Hale, the paintings conservator at the Met, wrote this in the catalog about visitors to the show. She said, they ask, why does she look so sad, so bored, frankly, so odd? They wonder, why do her eyes look blank? Why are her hands unfinished? Why does she appear to be tipping over? And what exactly was going on between the artist and his model? Hale's answer is that Cézanne was recalibrating the relation of what he saw, the subject, the motif, and how it could be expressed on canvas. What Cézanne said about his job as a painter was that it was to perceive and capture harmony from among many relationships. The painter must transpose them on a scale of his own invention while he develops them according to a new and original logic. Hale added, without expectations on either side, Cézanne seems to have felt the freedom to explore this process when painting his wife, using her as a template for experimentation. Well, her unfinished hands are holding a flower. I mean, if Cézanne had finished the hands and the flower, could any of this be more vivid or have more meaning? I doubt it. Hortense was a very good sport. These two paintings hang together at the Philadelphia Museum. Her body language is subtle. The expressions are never smiling, always pensive, sometimes withdrawn, sometimes we might think needy, even imploring. But, of course, it's too early and too easy, I should say, to project emotional states on people we have never seen in the original. Now and then, Cézanne shows her in a way we have to call tender. Here at the top, she shares the sheet of watercolor paper with a bouquet of hydrangeas. Their French name is Hortensia. Here, now she sits stable on a pyramid of skirt, secure on a little wooden chair, not in a household full of floating attributes, but inside in the garden at the family manor at Aix. After Cézanne's father died a few years earlier, tensions in the family relaxed some, and Hortense was welcome finally at the Jardin Bouffant. The portrait is not only unusual for its outdoor light, but also that he made a pencil study of Hortense's head sometime beforehand. The changes are slight, but they're symptomatic. In the painting, the lips are a bit less curvy, and the nose and eyebrows treated with straight lines. Her cowlick is gone to emphasize the oval, mask-like oval of her face. This is an impressionist subject, you know, and well-dressed women in winter gardens. The comparison is by Manet. And a dozen years earlier, a couple who were friends of his, painting them with the best of manners, comme il faut. You've just seen that the background, her surroundings, makes suggestions about her in a new kind of way. In the case of this portrait, the method is different and centuries old. You show a man, a writer, in his habitat with his work and at work. This man, Gustave Geffroy, was a new friend in 1895, a man who'd published the first profile of Cézanne, Cézanne was delighted and grateful for it and offered to paint Geffroy's portrait. Well, Cézanne had to be thinking not just about getting a good likeness of Geffroy, but also about the competition from Manet, there in the middle, who had painted Émile Zola in his study with a display of letters and artistic memorabilia, and competition at the right from Degas, who had painted another prominent critic, Edmond Duranty, posed in deep thought in his impressive library. Cézanne liberated and animated the background and the still life. He made Geffroy less stagey and maybe a bit distracted. But after 3 months of almost daily sittings, Cézanne apologized, confessed that he couldn't complete the painting, and took it back. That's funny, because everything seems to be finished except the hands. It's never been clear just why Cézanne wasn't satisfied with it, but he soon broke with Geffroy. Word in art circles about Cézanne's extreme slowness didn't prevent this man on the left from having his portrait painted. That's his astute and ambitious art dealer, Ambroise Vollard, who had read Geffroy's flattering account of Cézanne. Vollard had a small gallery in a fashionable street, and in 1895 he gave Cézanne his first solo exhibition. About 150 paintings that he rotated during the show, selling many of them, some to artists who'd been admirers of Cézanne, Monet, Degas, and Pissarro, among others. Later on, Vollard described his experience to a friend who wrote this. Vollard has been posing every morning at Cézanne's for what seems like forever. As soon as he moves, Cézanne complains that he's made him lose his line of concentration. Vollard recalled how Cézanne reacted one time when he did move. "You wretch, you've spoiled the pose. Do I have to tell you again that you have to sit like an apple? Does an apple move?" Well, Vollard said this, that he had sat for 115 sessions, each beginning at 8 in the morning and ending at 11:30 at night. Even if that's an exaggeration, it became part of Cézanne's legend, this slow pace, deep thought that went into every stroke. This man, Joachim Gasquet, was a bright 23-year-old friend who'd been taking long walks with Cézanne in Aix and had a real rapport with him. Cézanne gave him that tilted pose and keen expression that he'd been giving other friends long before. In the pictures you've seen, but he only gave Gasquet 5 or 6 sittings and then left the picture unfinished. It gives us a good look, though, at how Cézanne worked. You can see pencil lines under the thinnest first layers. On the forehead, you can see the washy patches of yellow and blue. On the near cheek, you can see a few big curving swoops of pink over a lavender swoop that makes the shadow. Gasquet said, I thought he'd given it up. Later, I discovered that he'd spent 60 more sessions on it. He'd worked on it after I left. He'd been painting from memory. Cézanne almost never got a commission for a portrait or gave wages to models for his figure compositions. Once, though, Vollard hired a teenage Italian boy called Michelangelo di Rosa, and Cézanne made 6 paintings of him, all in different poses and states of mind, mostly dreamy, even absent or sullen. And one, the largest of them, the boy in the middle, there gets a sort of hip shot pose, the classical contrapposto that comes down to Cézanne from the Renaissance and centuries of life drawing exercises. An art historian friend of ours wrote a delightful essay about this pose called The Renaissance Elbow that went backward, beginning with Mick Jagger. Cézanne studied statues in the Louvre and locally at Aix, and he made very many drawings of poses that never left him all his life. This is a good moment to return to another of Cézanne's old-fashioned interests that never left him in the figurative art of the Renaissance, including history painting and idyllic outdoor subjects. When I was a student in New York, I looked at this painting by Cézanne in the Museum of Modern Art almost every time I came. You couldn't miss it. The curator put it right in the middle of the wall at the entrance to the modern and contemporary galleries. So it was the first thing you saw. Also, for this installation, he parked the John the Baptist by Rodin outside to welcome you to modern art. The label said that the subject here had interested Cézanne since its youth, and the Barnes collection had the evidence up in the right, which is this composition of bathers in a river valley with Mont Sainte-Victoire in the distance, a major project that Cézanne had worked on 10 years earlier. So in the MoMA bather, he took it up again 10 years later, but because he hadn't been satisfied with the pose, he had a photographer shoot the model, and using this photo, he corrected the head and the legs. He had chosen another impressionist subject here, young men swimming out of doors in a landscape. This is Basile. And it recalled for Cézanne some of the happiest times of his life, hiking around the river valley as a carefree teenager with his fellow schoolmates and skinny dipping. After fixing up the composition a dozen years later, and obviously feeling it was satisfactory, Cézanne made a color lithograph of it. Having visited the south of France around this time, Paul Gauguin was a big admirer of Cézanne's, describes him this way: a man of the Midi, a man who spends his entire days in the mountains reading Virgil and looking at the sky. Therefore, his horizons are sky, his blue's very intense, and the red in the work has astounding vibrancy. He said, just like Virgil, who has many meanings and can be interpreted as one wishes, his work has a metaphorical sense with two aims. Its essence is imaginative as it is realistic. So this idea of Cézanne as a kind of Provençal Virgil, a poet dreaming up fantasy landscapes in modern dress, is an idea that generated images that run all the way through Cézanne's work from the start to the finish, and nude bathing is only part of it. To show some of the variety, the picture at the top left is a bit of a mystery, but seems to have three young men on the riverbank, including Cézanne himself, in the company of three nude women, real or imagined by the men we don't know. And below it, at the bottom there, a little painting has two contemporary men and a sort of doll-like 18th century girl, all of them decorous. At the right, a young man daydreaming who resembles his own 16-year-old son, Paul, maybe daydreaming of the company he'd like to be keeping, such as the foursome at the top, all classical poses derived from ancient Greek and Roman statues. Some of his painted fantasies, like the one at the bottom, connect to a puzzling group of earlier pictures we saw in the first lecture with imaginary scenes of violence and rape and murder. Rather than being symptoms of personality disorders, as some critics used to feel, these may well have been stimulated by stories that he read in the contemporary, well, either in classical literature, that is Greek and Latin epics, but there's also a lot of explicit violence in contemporary historical fiction by Provençal writers, so the connection doesn't seem far-fetched. In any case, let's now return to Cézanne's landscapes of the 1880s and end. His wanderings in the Provençal territory around Aix led Cézanne's imaginations sometimes to paint cabins and farm buildings that were abandoned or ruined, but were sometimes still lived in. They had a kind of old-fashioned romantic allure for him. Not far from the Bibemus quarry is an even stranger sight. It's the Chateau Noir, hardly a chateau, but it's a big country house perched up above the valley, built or being built for a local businessman some 40 years before and then abandoned, never finished. Cézanne prowled around making drawings like that. And here you see the upper part of two buildings made of that familiar orangey reddish sandstone that we saw in the quarry. After Cézanne's father died and his in-laws sold the family property in Aix, the Jardin Buffon, in 1889, Cézanne tried to buy the Chateau Noir, but couldn't. As he moved around it, he could see it looking like an actual medieval ruin with neo-Gothic pointed windows and a massive structure beneath it, built on cliffs, on a steep slope, cliffs above that were and thick with huge pines and oaks and brush. For Cézanne, the trees gave it a spooky flavor, as though they were reaching out to finish the job. Having failed to buy the place, he rented a room in what was left of the building, this little stone cabin at the top, so he could stash his painting equipment there. And in the courtyard, there was an elderly pistachio tree that he studied in one of the most beautiful of his watercolors on the left. He set about exploring the rocky grounds where, at the right, there were some relics of earlier times, a big cistern in the middle and a millstone at the left, cylindrical shapes that Cézanne often spotted in the landscape. Here's the cistern again at the left, painting on the right, I should say, with a huge limestone boulder that's landed between the red rock of the ground and the steep slope behind it. I think Cézanne's composition must have fed his thoughts about time and sequence. And the cistern is a way for humans, after all, to survive in arid places. At some point, that boulder at the right invaded this little bit of empty level ground, and now it's as though we're almost behind bars, confined, restrained by the young trees. The boulder stays put. The slender trees all around go on growing, and they have branches that make sort of joyous arcs of green. There's an equilibrium here. At the left, you see a view towards the rocky caves above the chateau that Cézanne studied in oil paintings like this one. His geologist and paleontologist friend Marion had discovered, as I mentioned, prehistoric relics in caves nearby this. And Cézanne, knowing their ancient human history, must have been even more attracted to those rocks. Here on the left, the trees bend before the overarching mass of rock, which is moved in the past. You can see that there are boulders at the bottom, and let them grow tall and spread their canopies and thrive. At the right, I think one of the greatest paintings of Cézanne at all. Here the colors are abbreviated into large translucent patches like watercolor, and the opposing forces, rocks on one side, trees on the other, are in equilibrium. The curator Françoise Cachin quotes Henri Matisse, who owned this picture on Cézanne's colors. Matisse wrote, "He applied some blue to make his yellow sing, but he used it with the discernment that was characteristic of Cézanne on every occasion, him and him alone. He had the great merit of trying to give to his task of painting its highest mission, which is to make his colors forces in a picture." And forces, I mean, they certainly are. You add to them the elemental drama of what Cézanne chooses to paint. Just as the end, one example of that drama, Cézanne made a series of studies in watercolor of various struggles, I would say, between rocks and trees. The writer and biographer of Cézanne, John Rewald, tried to retrace Cézanne's steps at the Chateau Noir and took this photograph, found some of the ledges and trees that Cézanne had painted 30 years before. Another favorite object for study for Cézanne had always been sculpture. The more Baroque, the better, the more physically expressive the figures. Here at the left of the Louvre is an abduction seen by a hero of Cézanne's, the great sculptor Pierre Puget. Cézanne made several drawings of it, never too old at the age of 40 to learn. It's been suggested that for Cézanne, these rocks and slender pines, these struggles in extreme slow motion of brute power and slender beauty, suggest human entanglement through the zigzag form of the trees, like the limbs thrown out, the aggressors leaning back, nature, in other words, as struggle. When he was well past 60, working hard in the studio at figure compositions and going off to paint views of the valley and distant mountains, Cézanne would still come back to the Chateau Noir and hike around and paint. He was stretching his amazing powers of suggestion and, you feel, having intimations of mortality. We see this even in the very last works, this sense of complete involvement in that landscape, those living things against those seemingly ageless but doomed human creations. Please come back in 2 weeks and see more of what I mean. Thank you.